The village here is dedicated to the god Njord, and Njord is one of the more important gods among the Vikings because he is one of the sea gods. And the Vikings would use the waterways to travel practically everywhere, and so obviously this meant that Njord became a kind of patron to travellers. And so if you wanted to have a safe journey, you wanted to make sure this god was happy, otherwise he might decide that you weren't very good and drown you while you're out at sea. And so that's kind of why they did it. And I also want to mention a little bit about why the Vikings started travelling, because we're often led to believe of the Vikings as being just raiders and going and taking lots of wealth from other places and coming back, and this is, while part of what they did, like many cultures back then, it's only a very small part, and the Vikings themselves didn't start off with the intention of raiding lots of other places. The reason they actually started to travel was because of the climate that was being experienced at that particular time. So we actually had a lot warmer climate about 1,000 years ago than we do today, and so this meant that the rate of people getting to adulthood increased dramatically, so there was a lot less infant mortality. Great for families, but within a very short amount of time it did mean that there was far less space for everybody to have their own farmstead, and to survive in those days farming was a very, very big important part of everything, and everybody would have had their own farms. And if you look around Gudvangen, you can pretty much see that most of that land is already taken up. The only bit of spare space I can see is right up on the mountain up there, and there's no way I'm going up there to build a farm. And so they started looking for new lands to settle down and to actually be able to have a good quality of life. And so this is why the Vikings started travelling. And so now I want to tell you a little bit about the boats of the Vikings. So if you'd like to come with me, I'll take you around to our boat, and I'll tell you a little bit about why they sailed around. This is a boat, it is not a ship. To be classed as a ship, it had to be 14 metres or longer in length. This is 12 metres, so it's just underneath the measurement required to be classed as a ship. And this is one of the reasons why there is no mast in the centre, because this was used primarily as a type of ferry to go across the fjords, short distances down the fjords, etc. And so really there's no need to have a sail on a ship or a boat that you're just doing this sort of thing with. And this particular one could have approximately 10 people plus their possessions all rowing at the same time. So it's kind of a good way of travelling. And also, for those that could actually afford to have one of these boats, it meant that you had an income because you could ferry people across. Indeed, even though it was able to have 10 people rowing, you only needed one person to row this because it is a kind of light vessel. You can see I can move it with quite relative ease, and that's just on my own. So that in the water, that's even easier to move. So that's why these were very, very practical for travelling up and down the fields. But even though this is a boat, the full-size ships were still constructed in the exact same way as this one here, obviously with the addition of a mast and far larger scale. And this was very, very different compared to how everybody else at that time were building vessels. So most people would build their ships and boats with a flat hull type of design, and then even the panels on the side of the ship would have been fairly straight. They would have used methods very similar to how the Vikings built their houses. So you can see all the boards are just placed flush against the other, and then on the inside there would be actual rods keeping everything in place. So you'd have boards on the back holding it. Now that is great if you're building a house because it makes it nice and rigid, it's strong, and it's not gonna blow over in wind, etc. But on a ship, that's actually a very bad way of building because, first of all, the flat hull would make it too unstable and easily capsize when you take it out onto deeper waters. But it also has very little flexibility, and you actually want flexibility in a ship, otherwise it'll just crack and break whenever waves keep hitting into it. So that is why it was very useful to have done what the Vikings did, which is first of all inventing the curved hull, which of course we still use to this day, and also inventing what we call the Clinker Method, so every single board overlaps the board that was placed on before it. Now when you build a ship like this, it retains a lot of flexibility because apart from the actual frame of the ship, there are no boards on the back holding this rigidly in place, so the whole ship would be very easily able to twist when waves are hitting into it from every sort of direction you can imagine. So it's a very practical way of building these ships. And it has other benefits as well. Because when you build a vessel like this, you inevitably end up with grooves on the outside of the ship. And so when this is in the water and moving, water will go into these grooves, and then it gets pushed back out. And this creates bubbles under the ship. And these bubbles lift it higher in the water, so now you've got far less friction, and you can get the vessel up to far greater speeds. The fastest we know from a replica of a ship that they built and using just sail power was approximately 40 knots. So they were incredibly fast vessels. But there is a problem which was discovered when they built this replica, and that is that when you go over 20 knots, you end up with the steering board breaking. And so if that breaks, you've got no means of actually steering your vessel at all. And so the Viking solution was very, very simple, but very clever, was having the board on the side of the ship, and then you could easily hoist it on board when you want to go at full speed. So your only problem with this is that for a time, you sacrifice all manoeuvrability for speed, but then when you have your manoeuvrability, you sacrifice all speed. So you've got to balance this out as much as possible. The other thing with this is that you have the term starboard originating from this saying, because that would have been the steerboard to the Vikings, and after 1,000 years that's just become anglicised and become starboard. So that's where you get that from. It also prevented you from docking this onto a pier or a port on the right side in case you break it, ergo port side of the vessel as well. So all of this dates back to Viking times, and indeed after the Viking Age ends, you actually find that they stop using the boards on the side for steering, so it kind of loses all of its meaning from the past, but the names kept on going. So that's the great advantages with the ships in general. The other thing with the Vikings, they were immensely clever when it came to constructing the vessel in other ways as well. So whereas a lot of people would use only the trunks of the tree to build their ships, the Vikings would use every single part of the trees that they cut down. Even if they can't use all the branches for this, they can still get used for something like axe handles and shafts for spears, etc. And the very smallest would end up as firewood, so nothing is going to waste completely. But what they would actually do is the older trees that they felled would end up being used to make the keel of the vessel. So they would make the piece going all the way under and round to the other side. This was important to be as strong as possible, because if you break your keel, you might as well set fire to the ship, because you can't repair that. The rest of the vessel, any part of it that breaks you can replace. But that keel is impossible to do so. So you have to be very, very strong in making sure that this is a good, hard piece of timber. If you're rich enough, you might be able to afford to do what we did with this metal bar that you can see on the underside of the keel. But you had to be very wealthy to afford that much metal in general, and you're already using a lot of metal with the nails that are needed in creating the ship. So that wouldn't have been done unless you were extremely wealthy. The other thing with this is that they would then use the lower trunk of these trees, which would have been too hard even for the keel, to make the areas where the oars would rest against. And so the trunk itself is used to make the backboard, which holds that in place. And then a branch, one of the larger branches of the tree, would be cut off and used to make the actual oar rest. When you do this, it has a lot of natural fibre going into the wood, which means that you can pull a lot of pressure onto that, and it's not going to break the actual oar mount itself. So that's why it was important to do this. And the final things that they would actually use were the roots of the trees. So the roots of the trees would be used to make the ribs of this vessel. And so what they would do after seasoning the wood, which would take a very long time, several years to do it properly, you would then soak it in salt water. Now soaking it in salt water effectively opens up the fibres in the wood, while at the same time the salt preserves the wood so it doesn't decay. And then that means that you can get a very flexible piece of wood, even if it's extremely thick, so long as you soak it for a long enough amount of time. Today they do the same thing, except they also add pressure to this. They drop it to great depths in the water, and then this forces the fibres to expand much more rapidly, and then that means that you can get the same result within a few days as opposed to having to wait months at a time to get it. But that is how they would have done it in the past as well.